Yeah, nice view, huh? That's Iceland. That's where I would like to go if I ever get lost somewhere. Okay, so you can hear me, right? Okay, great. Okay, should we start? 15:02. afternoon. Okay, let's start and speak a little bit about what we are supposed to do with our servers in Spike. Okay, let's start this presentation. I lose sight of the board, so I don't know who's if anybody's asking any questions in the chat or anything, I will answer after because I can't see the board right now, and we can continue the discussion. Okay, so basically this presentation today is about understanding what kind of server structure and installs and how we call them we have in our day-to-day business. Okay, so basically when we start a project, from when we start a project to the steps that we take to get to production, kind of what are the naming conventions and the steps that we kind of would like to take, okay, or that we're trying to take. Okay, so what does a typical flow of a project look like? Okay, so we start a new project. Besides the set of rules more or less defined about how a project should be named, and other steps that we have in some playbooks and some documentation lying around, the main idea is that when we start a project, we have to create a Mattermost channel for that, so that all of the people that are on that project are in touch, are on the same page, and being able to talk to each other and communicate with each other. Mattermost is our most important communication tool in the company, and it's where we spend most of our time, so that's not surprising at all. We also have to create a repository for it, or more than one, depending on the project and how many different types of software that project may need. I mean, we have projects that have two coreBOSes integrating with some other software, and and they have to all communicate with each other, and we have like that structure with two or three other different pieces of software. So each one has to have its own repository and its own naming convention, and all of that should be all set up together. As a side note, when those projects get that complex, because usually we just have one coreBOS and one front end, so you kind of just have two repositories, one for the back end, one for the front end, and more or less that's all you need. But if it gets really complicated, where you have the back end and you have a front end, but then you have another front end and you have two other tools that are doing something else in the back end, when that number grows and it gets really complex, ideally we should have a Docker compose structure that kind of sets it all up for you and gets everything ready. One of these classes that I give on Thursday will be about Docker. I really want to get into that one because it's a really powerful tool, helps us a lot, and I want kind of everybody to be comfortable with that, so we will talk about that more in the future. But that is kind of the the thing that we're aiming at there. Okay, basically, besides those steps, besides the little steps that we have to take there, and onboard all the people, define who's the BEM and who's the project manager and who's the developers and all of that stuff, and put them all together and start, getting the documentation, which is probably in a TiddlyWiki somewhere. What I'm actually trying to get at is that we have to set up a demo where somebody where that team will be able to test that back end and that front end, and be sure that what is being implemented or what needs to be done, all of the steps of configuration can be shown and tested, and and make sure that everybody's seeing the same thing. That means that once you have that and the developers are onboarded to that project, they will install that back end, that coreBOS, and that React admin or whatever they are installing and working with, they will install them locally on their laptops. So that means that now we already have one install for this client or for this project on a server somewhere, and 1, 2, or 3, or 4, many installs of that same software in different developer computers. Okay, because obviously they're going to want to develop locally, do all of the tests that they have, all the modifications to that. When they are more or less confident that it's correct, what has been asked them to develop, they will move it into the demo server so it can be validated. Okay, so now we have at least 2 different installs of this project on 2 different computers. Probably more, because usually we have more developers working on that. Okay, that's where the cycle of development, configuration, and validation starts. People start asking for development. They start testing them. They're validating that they're working. That moves on. The code moves from one place to the other, from the developer's computer to the demo, and to the analyst or the project manager. Probably downloads it into his or her computer, and they install it and validate things there. So we have probably even more installs running around. And at one point, once the thing starts looking more or less acceptable, we onboard the client, and we onboard them normally into that demo server. We give them access. We start teaching them how it looks, how it works. They start giving us feedback, and we go back to that development, configuration, and validation cycle, which usually this time is shorter, but more focused on the client's needs, because that always kind of changes when the client actually sees the project moving and running. They always kind of change their mind. And finally, we reach a point where we say, okay, this looks good. This looks actually like it's going to be able to be used in my vision, okay, in the client's vision. So we usually can set up a final demo on another server where we will do the final test and validations before going into the final touches and production. Okay, that is usually what I understand and what I have seen up to now that we kind of do when we are doing the projects. Okay, we have given this kind of logical flow naming convention. Not just we, I mean we as in the developer project community actually. And we're going to go over that same structure again, but using the official names. Okay, so that demo server that we were talking about right now, where we install the first version of the project and we start developing on it, is what we are calling UAT. It's a user acceptance test. It's an environment where in the end the user has to accept that what is working there is what they are actually looking for. Okay, that same demo server, that same UAT server is going to serve us as our own initial validation steps. Okay, I mean that's where we're going to be developing all of our work and doing things. That's why we call that, that's what we call the UAT server. Okay, then obviously the developers have their own computers, they have their own development installs. Those aren't really much of a worry, except for the next point that we're going to talk about on the next section, where it's basically about moving information around. We onboard the client in the UAT development environment. Okay, so basically up to now it's just the same thing. It's all the UAT that's taking all of the load. Finally, when we get to that point where we have to do the final validation with the client and with all of the requirements and make sure that everything is actually ready to go into production, we have the AAT server. Okay, this is what we have called AAT server. The dominant documentation about this kind of things usually calls this server the staging server, because it's ready to go into the stage. It's kind of everything is all set up and ready to go. Actually, the difference between the UAT server and the AAT server is that in the UAT server you usually are using sandboxed emails and API calls, or you're using a developer account that doesn't. I mean, for example, if we have an integration with PayPal, obviously that UAT you don't want to start making payments on it, so you would have a developer account connection to PayPal where you could actually do the process and test the process, but you're not actually processing payments and that kind of things. That's what the UAT is for. And the AAT has the difference where you are actually testing on a real account and making sure that the payments are being done correctly and everything is kind of. So it's that basically it's the only difference that we have, is that the AAT is really one step away from production. Then we have the production servers. The production servers are that. It's just another install on another server. I will talk about that now. And okay, here AAT is also called staging. And before we get to the next point, I want to explain a little bit about what is the, okay, this is kind of the vision and what we try to talk about and try to set up in Spike. Usually we have in UAT and AAT, we have low cost servers that we can just kind of spin up kind of fast and without too much effort. And okay, they're not top notch and they're not wonderful, but they're good enough to do the demos and to do the development and to get things around. And they are more than enough to get what we need. And we have been using them for a long time. But the production servers is another thing. Production servers have to be carefully defined and structured. Okay, I mean, when we get to that point where we say, okay, we are going into production, we have to actually stop and discuss what that means. I mean, does this client, how many users is this client going to have? Do we need to have load balancing? Is one server enough? How much memory should that server have? Is that server ours or theirs? I mean, all of a set of questions that as the tech ops team in the company really don't need to know when you ask them for a UAT or an AAT server. I mean, we know enough to where we have to put things and what servers we have and if we need another one or what kind of servers we're going to set up for that kind of environment. But when we go to production, it's a whole new game because we're going to have real users, we're going to have real load, we're going to have a whole bunch of things that we have to, questions that we have to answer and that we have to know the answer to. Okay? And obviously it's not the same if somebody comes up and says, no, it's that we're going to have, I don't know, 10,000 users and I need a load balancer and 2 servers in the back and I want to have the database offloaded to some other place and, you know, database managed on something with a whole bunch of cache and I don't know, whatever. There's so many combinations, so many utterly incredible combinations and things that we can do to set up a production environment, and they all depend on the answer to the questions of how many people are going to be using that software, what kind of requirements does that software have, what kind of pieces does the whole project have. I mean, there's just too many variables. So the message that I'm trying to get across is when we get to that AAT point and we're ready to go to production, we have to stop. You have to talk with somebody, the project manager, the BEM, the tech ops team. We have to get together and say, okay, what are we going into? Where are we doing this? What do we need? And we make the decisions. We buy the software, or we discuss with the client if they're buying the software, and we define the steps to get that in place with the timeline that we need. Okay, it's not the same to set up a load balancer on GCP and a bunch of servers than to just boot up a DigitalOcean server and install Ubuntu. I mean, there are really times are totally different. Okay, so we have to kind of stop at that point and dedicate a little bit of time to defining what we are getting ourselves into and what we need, and if the price is covered, because obviously it's not the same price that as the low-cost servers that we have for UAT, which we kind of just, okay, we can run with those. Okay, so that's the structure that we're aiming at. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we are actually doing in most cases. But this is kind of a formal presentation of that structure and what I would like to keep everybody onboarded with and in mind, so that we can kind of make it easier for everybody to understand where we are and what we're doing. The last thing I want to comment here is that I really don't believe in the AAT server. I guess by experience, I end up debugging in production a lot. I kind of really believe in that. Basically, I suppose because coreBOS kind of really lets me do that. coreBOS in general is not really, we don't really have too many cases where it's hard to debug something in coreBOS. Usually it takes very little time, downtime and the like. I mean, so it's not something that I have really gotten bitten by before. You know, I mean, if a server does break somewhere, you kind of just jump in and fix something, and usually it doesn't even break that way. It usually breaks like one module breaks something and you kind of fix that one while everybody else is working on the other ones. So the impact is not really high in general. I mean, we have had some cases where it has happened, but Usually when we have a lot of downtime, it's because of a hardware problem, not because of a software problem. So I usually jump and skip that AAT thing. I kind of believe that with the UAT and the production servers, we kind of have enough. Okay, so I'm not saying that the AAT is wrong. I mean, it totally does have its logic and it fits into the structure. But if the project is kind of small and not really that complex, you can find many places, many projects that we have where we just don't have the AAT. We just have the UAT and the production server, and basically that's all we need. Okay, so so we kind of are flexible on that AAT. Okay, okay. This brings us to the biggest problem that we have with all of this, which is we have a whole bunch of installs with a whole bunch of different configurations moving around, and we have the problem of moving data around. Okay, when somebody adds a field or needs a module or needs anything, I have some things here. Yeah, okay, modules, fields, maps, actions, user, permissions, settings, all of those things that happen in coreBOS, and that you actually jump into your coreBOS in the backend and start configuring users and the permissions and all that. There's a big problem there, because if all of a sudden you find an error in the demo server in UAT and you send that error to a developer, the developer doesn't have the user and the permissions and the settings that are in the demo. So they actually have to download the whole database and install that database, update their database in their development computer to be able to reproduce the problem and fix it. There's basically no way around that one, because even coreBOS doesn't really have a solution to that problem. I mean, it can be coded, but it's not easy. But we do have very good solutions for sharing modules, sharing fields, moving maps around, and moving actions around. And that's coreBOS Updater. Okay, that is the tool that we use to be able to sync all of the changes that happen in one coreBOS to another coreBOS. So that is the right way to do things. Lately, we have added a bunch of things in coreBOS that kind of break that rule. Okay, I was kind of against that. I have been against that for a long time because those tools make moving that information around much more harder. Okay, so for example, we have now manual change sets where you can go to coreBOS Updater and you can put in a structure in the description field and create a bunch of fields or hide a bunch of fields, okay, or do any kind of actions. There's a set of actions you can do there. That is an action, a set of steps that you take in one coreBOS. If you want to move or add those fields or do those exact same changes in another coreBOS, you have to either go to that coreBOS and replicate those steps, or export the record from the first one and import it in the other one, or copy paste things around, or you have to manually do something. On the other hand, if you get that same change set and you create a coreBOS change set in the code and you update that using JIT, you make a commit and you put that PHP file and that XML definition in the repository, all of the other installs, the only thing they have to do is a pull. They do a JIT pull, they get that script, they go into coreBOS Updater sees the change and applies it. Everybody's on the same page, everything is really easy and kind of following the same logical flow that coreBOS does every day when we make changes to the database in coreBOS Updater. And additionally, we have a registered change. I mean, if you do a JIT log, you can see that who added that change on what day, and probably if they did a good commit message, why they added that change set. On the other hand, if somebody just drops into the coreBOS and starts adding that change set manually, we kind of lose that. Not completely, because you have the assigned user and you have the date and you have the context there, and they could even put the name of the change set correctly, which is kind of like the commit message. But the thing is that it's not easy to move around to other coreBOSes. That's where that kind of gets in the way. The same happens for the module builder, which is really nice tool to have, very comfortable, but it's very dangerous because it's even much more worse than a chain set, because a chain set is usually just a set of fields, or you're hiding something, or that. I mean, here in the module builder, we're talking about a whole new module, which installs a whole bunch of fields and changes the web service and adds tab IDs. In database, it's a big mess. It gets, there's a whole bunch of meta information that gets spread out all over the place. And that's really hard. I mean, that's almost impossible to replicate on another coreBOS. I mean, or not, okay, not impossible, but I mean, it's a lot of steps and a lot of work. You have to be clicking around and adding all those fields. If you export the module and you install it there, then you may even get conflicts, because if somebody has to do a JIT commit at one point, so that module gets registered in the repository, that means that when all the other guys pull, they're going to get a conflict, because the files are already there and they're coming in again. So it's really delicate. Okay, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but really it's something that we should be very careful with. I mean, I would imagine that if I had to use the module builder, I would probably use it in the same sense, that the same way I do new modules. Okay, I'm really comfortable creating modules. I know how to do that, and I know how to copy paste things around. I usually go to the manifest and I start moving text around, and I'm really comfortable with that. So in the end, what I end up with is module name directory and some and that's it really. Yeah, well, it depends if it has some templates, but anyway, I end up with some files on the disk, and I commit those files, and I probably add a change set to to install that module, and I distribute that. I upload it to the repository. That means that all of the other people that are working on that project just have to pull. They will get the change set, they will get all the files of the module, and they will be able to install it just using the coreBOS updater like always. So if I had to use the module builder, I would do it in the same total idea. In my local coreBOS install, they have asked me to create a module. So I go to my local coreBOS install, I go to the module builder, I create the module locally in my local install, in my local development install, not even the project install. I test it, I make sure it's working, all the relations are good, everything's correct. I end up with a bunch of files in my hard disk. I get those files, I put them into the project, I do the commit, I do the change set, I upload it, and everybody doesn't care if I use the module builder or if I did it copy pasting text around. Okay, basically the idea is that we have to get the files into the file system. We have to get them into JIT, because JIT is the one that's going to take care of controlling and moving all of that data around. And we have to get it into change sets. We have to get all of that code into change sets one way or another, at least as much as we can. I mean, like I said before, user permissions and settings, there's not really a nice or easy way of doing that at all. So our goal is to we share code and move things around using JIT. Okay, that's how we do that as much as we can. Okay, translations are a little bit different, but it's basically the same idea. Translations have translation files. We have base translation files for each language, and then we have the custom translation files, which are created usually using the translation editor inside the application, but they're just files in the end, and they can be also made manually. Once they are there, the idea is that you have to commit them. Okay, I mean, I enter a lot of installs running around, and people just kind of create the translations, and you do a JIT status in the production server or in the UAT server, and you can see the language files, the custom language files, because the translator actually created them. Those files have to be committed. Those files are part of the project. When I move that project to another server, I'm going to do a JIT pull on the other server, and I want to get those custom translations. So when you finish translating, or when you make a change in the translation using the coreBOS UI, sooner or later you have to go to the code and do a JIT commit. You have to get those files into the repository so everybody can share them. Okay, I mean, even in the extreme case, which is kind of rare, what could happen, where one of those files contains an error, if the developer you send that error to does not do a JIT pull and get the file, they won't even be able to reproduce it, and we're wasting time that we shouldn't. Okay, so all of the changes somehow or other should get into the JIT repository as much as feasible. Okay, I know that not everything is possible, and sometimes it's just easier to just go and do something. Okay, I totally understand that. And in the end, We can always, especially in the development and even on the demo, we can always go to the production database, make a copy of that one, because that one is the mother of all of the whole project. I mean, that's the one that is actually holding the whole latest version of the permissions and the real state of the project. You can get a copy of that database and, you know, copy and upload it into your developer laptop and get the latest state. You don't even need to, you know, to get the coreBOS updates or anything. But usually we should kind of play around with that. Okay, that takes me to the last part, which is basically, okay, if we are going to do that, if we actually need to get the production database and move it into the demo, update the demo database with the production, or update some of the developer computers that we have around because they need to debug something, we have to anonymize the data. Okay, it is not acceptable for a production database to be in the laptop or in the computer of the company. I mean, we shouldn't do that. Okay, I understand that. Okay, sometimes we can be a little flexible because of urgencies and things, but in general, that should not happen. Okay, at all. We have a very, very powerful anonymization process. We have the tools, we have the procedures, we have all of the code ready. And okay, it takes a little bit of time and you have to know what you're doing, but it is not complicated. So it is really no excuse to have production data on our personal computers. Okay, so really please take that into consideration. If you need a copy of the production database, ask your project manager or your BEM for the necessary time to anonymize that database and use the anonymized database, not the production data. Okay, and that's it. That's basically what I wanted to share. I am available for any mistakes that I have made here. I mean, any things that I may have skipped or forgotten to comment or that I should have commented. And obviously I'm very available. I don't know if there's any questions on this thing. Where is this? No. Okay. Okay, then as I said, I am available for any questions. If we need to discuss something with anybody else, I mean, get together with more people just to enhance these definitions or put in some other steps that I missed, reach out and we will discuss. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.